start recording at this end. Okay. Okay, so welcome back. Thanks so much for coming to this third lecture. This time I'm going to be talking about animal ethics, which in a sense, I suppose, would be the first thing to leap to mind when we think about philosophy of animals. We all confront this issue, should we eat animals in particular, but also questions like, should we do scientific experiments on animals? And these are things that even non-philosophers think about a lot. In fact, as I've been doing a lot of philosophy of animals in the last few years, it struck me that this might even be the philosophical topic that non-philosophers think about most at a philosophical level. So you can go into basically any place, and at least any place in Europe or North America, and I guess in a lot of other countries too, and you can ask people whether they eat meat, and they'll understand why you're asking the question, and they'll have some kind of justification for whether they eat meat or not, which will be broadly a philosophical justification. I mean, they might just say, I eat meat because it tastes good, but usually they'll give some kind of rationale for their choice, right? And this interest in animal ethics is something that is both reflected in professional philosophy and has in fact, to some extent, been prompted by professional philosophy. So I think not only is this an example of a philosophical topic that non-philosophers, that is non-professional philosophers, think about a lot, but it might be the single best example of a topic where professional philosophy has actually had an impact on the way people behave, because the vegetarian/vegan movement and the animal rights movement has received a great push forward by philosophers, with the most famous example being Peter Singer, who's a utilitarian philosopher who's argued very strongly for animal rights, although actually he doesn't have a theory of animal rights, as we'll see in a minute. But he's not the only one. There are many other philosophers who have engaged with animal ethics over the last several decades. And in fact, the very fact that this has been such an influential recent part of philosophy, I think has probably led people into thinking that it's also a kind of philosophical issue that did not get considered in earlier periods of philosophy. In fact, if you read Peter Singer and some other philosophers talking about the history of their own topic, they'll say things like, well, in the bad old days, and the bad old days means before the 1960s, philosophers never took this issue seriously. In fact, one of Peter Singer's first publications on this goes back to Pico della Mirandola, who seems like a pretty strange person to blame for anything. So this 19-year-old genius wunderkind of the Italian Renaissance writes this treatise about how wonderful humans are. And Singer says, see, this is the problem. Philosophers are always thinking anthropocentrically. But in fact, it's not true that philosophers throughout history have ignored the question of animal ethics. And we're going to see today that there are several texts in the Islamic tradition that do talk about this. You already know from the first lecture that there are also works from Antiquity that talk about it, in particular by Porphyry. And we're going to touch on those as well now, because what I want to do is talk about first, the principles that were given in Antiquity and are now being given in modern day or contemporary animal philosophy in order to defend benevolence towards animals. And by benevolence, I mean not just doing whatever we want with them. It's not quite clear what benevolence will amount to, right? So once you decide that animals should be an object of ethical concern, you have to decide what that would amount to. For example, some of the people who we will see arguing for animal benevolence believe that you should be vegetarian, others don't. But at a minimum, it would at least lead to the thought that you shouldn't, for example, torture an animal for no reason. And if you thought that animals aren't a fit object of moral concern at all, then you would think there was no problem with torturing an animal for no reason, just like you can like kick a rock for no reason, because rocks are not objects of our moral concern, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the ethical principles that actually led to these benevolent attitudes towards animals in Antiquity and much more recently, so really in the last few decades. And then I'm going to areas of discussion about animal ethics in the Islamic world. Basically, what I'm going to be doing there is talking about two sources or maybe principles of ethical reasoning that led authors to argue for benevolence towards animals. And the overall point is that these sources of ethical reasoning sort of overlap with the principles we find in antiquity and in modern day animal ethics, but not quite. So they're going to both resonate with what we can see in these other historical periods, including our own period, but they're also going to contribute something different. So you might think of this as a way of sort of enriching our palette of options when we're thinking about animal ethics. So one of these principles is going to be appeals to divine providence, and the other is going to be appeals to teleology, which is something we've already seen in earlier lectures, especially in the first lecture when I talked about teleology and Galen and Aristotle. The reason I did that was to set up this discussion today. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about animal ethics in antiquity and in modern day philosophy. In antiquity, I think that, first of all, the idea of being benevolent towards animals or giving philosophical rationale for being benevolent towards animals was much less common than it is now. So we have these texts by Plutarch and Porphyry. We have the other elements of Greek philosophy that I talked about, for example, Pythagoreanism. Again, there we have vegetarianism. And since maybe because these texts are not very extensive, I think that the rationales given in antiquity for benevolence towards animals really boil down always to the same idea. And I'm leaving out of consideration here Porphyry's point that you shouldn't eat meat because it tastes good. So this idea that you should be avoiding pleasure, because I don't take that to be an ethical principle for taking animals seriously as objects of our ethical care or concern, right? That's more like being concerned about your own welfare as a philosopher. So the principle I have in mind that I think runs through pretty much all of the other reasons given for being benevolent towards animals in antiquity is the idea of kinship. So the thought here, and I don't mean literal kinship like we're related to them as a family. What I mean is that they are sufficiently akin to us, they're sufficiently similar to us, or we share an overlapping nature with them to a sufficient extent that we should be benevolent towards them. And we've seen a couple of versions of this thought. One is that if reincarnation is true, in other words, if humans can be reincarnated as animals or vice versa, then they have the same kind of souls that we do. And in fact, they might be former humans that are members of our family. So actually we might have literal kinship, right? So the sheep might be my grandfather, so I shouldn't sacrifice the sheep. As we saw, that was what was maybe going on in that passage from the Facultad. Then we have this other idea that there may be a relationship of justice, as the Stoics put it, between animals and humans. Now, this is something they deny, right? So they say there is no relationship of justice, but this is precisely because of the failure of animals to be sufficiently akin to us or sufficiently like us. So actually it's invoking the same principle. It's just denying that there's enough likeness between humans and animals to give us a reason to take them seriously as moral objects. But that makes it possible for Porphyry to come along and say, no, you're wrong. Animals can talk, they can reason just like we can. And so we should have a relationship of justice with them. So I think both in the case of reincarnation and in the case of worrying about this, whether there can be justice between animals and humans, it's really this idea of similarity or kinship that sits at the base of antique theories of ethics. Now, in the modern day, we have, by contrast, two major streams or big thoughts. One, which we'll see has been especially put forward by Peter Singer, although certainly a lot of people have then carried it on from his work, is broadly consequentialist or utilitarian. So the idea is that the things we do have consequences, and we should do things that have better consequences, not worse consequences. And the better consequences are the ones that satisfy valid interests. For example, I have an interest in not being tortured to death. It's bad for me to be tortured to death. And so, although maybe you could torture me to death if the payoff were sufficiently good in terms of other consequences, you'd have to find a pretty good argument for that, right? So you'd have to find some incredibly powerful countervailing good to balance out the bad of torturing someone to death. So that's one approach. The other approach, which rejects utilitarianism and consequentialism more generally, is a rights approach. And we're going to see that this has been offered as a kind of alternative to Peter Singer's account. So let's look at these in a little bit more depth. So first, just to go again over this point that we've seen in Porphyry, what the Stoics say about animals is that because they have no rationality, no logos, they don't have a relationship of, and here it's actually not clear how to translate this word, so the word is oikoiosis. This actually relates to the word oikos, which means house. So oikoiosis means something like being a member of your family or kinship, right? So because it's like something that would live in the same house as you, so to speak, which is interesting, actually, if you think about house pets, right? So the different way we feel about house pets and other animals, like even people who aren't vegetarians don't go around eating their own pets, right? And that's because they feel like the pets are a member of their family to some extent, presumably. Even if they had pets that were delicious, they might not eat them, right? So you might have a pet rabbit, and people do eat rabbit, right? There's rabbit stew in a way that people don't usually eat cats and dogs, at least not in European cultures. But you don't eat your pet rabbit, right? You don't eat Fluffy because she's oikeon to you. She's akin to you. The Epicureans have a similar viewpoint here, which is a little bit more kind of formal. So what they say is that because animals can't use reason, they can't enter into a relationship of quasi-legal obligation. So the idea here would be that you can't make a contract, like a legal contract or perhaps a social contract. Here we might think of sort of Hobbes' social contract theory. You can't make a contract with an animal because it can't agree. It can't make promises to you. And that's a presupposition of any relationship of justice. You have to have at least a tacit promise before you can violate your obligations to someone, right? Because how can you have an obligation to somebody if you don't offer up that you are obligated? That's the Epicurean thought here. So either way, the failure of rationality in animals, or that is the non-existence of rationality in non-human animals, means that there's no relationship of justice between us and them. And as I say, this is why Porphyry then argued, well, actually, animals can communicate, so they have outer logos, language, right? So they should have inner logos too. And that's all of these arguments that are given by the Stoics and Epicureans actually point in the other direction because they are sufficiently akin to us. Very different are modern day approaches, I would say. Although in a second, I'll get to something that might remind us a little bit of this idea about having similar nature or interests. So the most famous philosopher for animal ethics over the last several decades by far is Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian, which is a subspecies of consequentialism. So, and his basic idea, and I obviously know for some people saying I have to give a whole lecture
Peter,
on Singer too.
Sorry, something is wrong with your microphone. There's a sort of interference, not all the time, but sometimes we can hear some interference and it's difficult to understand.
Okay, maybe I'll just unplug this microphone and go with my normal mic.
Yeah, sorry for the interruption.
Is that any better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll go with that. So Peter Singer started making this case back in the 1970s. And what he argues is that the capacity of animals to suffer gives us a reason not to mistreat them and also not to kill them. So they have interests, as he puts it, just like we do. And he says that, and this is a quote from Peter Singer,
the limit of sentience is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. So his thought here is that if we can suffer and that's bad for us, then why wouldn't it be bad when animals can suffer, right? So they have an interest in not suffering, just like we do, and we should pay due weight to that interest. That doesn't mean that we are necessarily going to put as much weight on an animal's interest as on our own, because it depends how strong the interests are. So for example, it might be that a human has a prospect of a more complex, rich life than an animal, and that could give you a reason, for example, to save the human's life over the animal's life. So there are these classic thought experiments where you have like two lifeboats and they're both sinking and you only have time to rescue the inhabitants of one lifeboat. And Singer allows you to save the lifeboat with the human on it rather than the lifeboat with the dog on it, because the payoff is bigger, right? It's not because humans have some kind of intrinsic higher value or right to live than dogs. It's because they have the prospect of satisfying a richer set of interests than the dog. This approach, by the way, is not entirely new with Singer. So as he himself noted, there were predecessors to his view, in particular in the utilitarian tradition, which he belongs to. Jeremy Bentham, one of the first utilitarians, once wrote, "The question is not, can animals reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" So this is obviously, probably unknown to Bentham, is a direct repudiation of the whole discourse around animal ethics that we find in the Stoics and Porphyry. It's not about reason, it's not about speech, it's just about suffering or not suffering. Notice the fact that sentience is the border here means that we can do whatever we want to plants because they won't feel it, presumably. I mean, maybe we could study this and find out that they do feel it, but you can't morally abuse a plant in a morally significant way if the plant can't feel. And you certainly can't morally abuse a rock, right? So interestingly, this view has been attacked often by other proponents of animal rights because they think it doesn't provide a sufficiently strong basis for animal rights. And a good example here would be someone called Tom Regan, who argues, for example, that if we're going to go on utilitarian grounds, we would have to take seriously, for example, the prospect that thousands or hundreds of thousands of people might be put out of a job if everyone became a vegetarian, right? So, or suppose everyone becomes a vegan, right? Well, what if it turns out that that makes the economy collapse in certain places, like places that specialize in meat production? I mean, think about Argentina, right, where they make a lot of steak, right? So it's all very well to say, well, we should avoid causing suffering to the cows, but the cow farmer who's raising cows for meat will suffer as well. Now, it might turn out that Peter Singer is right, that on the whole, there will be less suffering if everyone's a vegetarian, but maybe it won't. And Tom Regan thinks that's already wrong. So he doesn't think that we should make the wrongness of mistreating animals dependent on the kind of empirical facts about how badly off people will be if everyone becomes a vegetarian, as opposed to how badly the animals are off now, and so on. It has to be said that, and I think Regan would agree with this, that you can get a long way with consequentialist arguments. So for example, consequentialist arguments make it abundantly clear that we shouldn't have factory farming of animals. But Tom Regan doesn't think that's enough. He wants to have the idea that animals actually have rights that can't be violated, no matter what else happens. And for example, no matter how much humans might benefit from tormenting an animal, you still can't do it. So that's an example of a pro-animal benevolence philosopher who rejects Singer's approach. Another example would be Christine Korsgaard, who famously is a Kantian, or some kind of Kantian, a neo-Kantian perhaps. And she adapts Kant's ethics in a way that we do not find in Kant to make them suitable for use in the animal ethics debate. And of course, being a Kantian, she's more like Regan than she is like Singer, right? So Kant is interested in absolute moral principles rather than weighing up consequences, right? He's not a consequentialist. He's the ultimate non-consequentialist, in fact, in modern ethics. So what Korsgaard says here is really complicated and interesting. Again, probably too complicated for me to do justice to it quickly, but I'll try. So what she says is, well, people think that in Kant, you just arrive at moral principles by using sort of logic or rules of reasoning. You just try to not contradict yourself, right? So for example, don't lie, because if everybody lied, it would undermine the practice of truth telling, and then there would be no point in lying. So it's a contradiction in terms. And she said, well, he does do that, but also sometimes in moral reasoning in Kant, you need to factor in what is naturally good for humans. For example, if in order to get to a Kantian moral principle against hitting people for no reason, you have to know that hitting people causes them pain, right? So you have to factor in, and here we have, again, the idea of interests coming in, which we saw in Singer. We have the idea of interests because there are just natural goods for humans, which we have to respect in forming our moral principles, or in laying down the moral law, as Kant might say. And since this is the case, we should recognize that there are also natural goods in the case of animals. This will not be the same as what's naturally good in the case of humans, but we can recognize it and we should respect it. So as she writes, although what is naturally good for a human being is different in some respects from what is naturally good for another animal, there are also common elements. Part of what we confer value on when we respect ourselves is certain interests that we have, not as rational beings, but simply as sentient ones, such as the interest in avoiding suffering. Those interests are the ones we share with the other animals. Now that may sound a lot like Singer, right? Because it sounds like she's saying, well, animals can suffer just like we can. We don't like to suffer, so presumably animals don't like to suffer, so we shouldn't make them suffer. But it's important to see that she's not arguing for this on consequentialist grounds, because she's a Kantian, not a consequentialist. What she's saying is that just as we treat other humans as being ends in themselves and having interests that we must respect no matter what else happens, so as soon as we realize that animals have natural interests, we should recognize those interests and treat them as ends in themselves. We can't instrumentalize the welfare of animals, good or bad, for the purpose of something else, which in a way is exactly what Singer allows, right? Singer allows you to sort of weigh up the interests of one being against the interests of another being. So for example, maybe I'm allowed to experiment on this animal because it will save a lot of people's lives. Whereas this, the animal rights approach of Regan, or this approach by Korsgaard, might actually tell you that you can't do that because the animal has an inviolable right not to be experimented on. Okay, so again, obviously one could say much more about contemporary animal ethics, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move on now to the Islamic world. But before I do that, I want to admit that at first blush, everything I've just said might seem pretty irrelevant because we don't find consequentialism among philosophers in the Islamic world who are inspired by the Greek tradition, which is what I'm focusing on here. We actually do find consequentialism among Kalam authors. So for example, there's an excellent book by Ayman Shihadeh about Fakhreddin Razi, the philosopher I was discussing yesterday. And there Shihadeh is pointing out that Razi's Kalam style ethics is basically consequentialist. And that goes very well with everything we saw yesterday about how animals might get to go to the afterlife and they might have to be recompensed for their suffering by God and so on. But among the Falasifa, the ones who are following in the line of Aristotle, Platonism, and Galen, we don't really find consequentialist ethics. We find eudaimonist virtue ethics like Aristotle, as we'll see. Also, there is just no theory of rights at all. So an approach like Tom Regan or Korsgaard's will not be directly relevant because it's too early, right? There's no Kant yet. There's no theory of rights in this context, at least not that I know of. Furthermore, as far as the ancient debate over animal ethics goes, as we saw, that really turned on the idea of kinship between humans and animals. And as we saw in the second lecture, the conventional view, which most philosophers adopt, denies kinship between humans and animals, right? We're rational, they're not. We have immaterial souls, which are capable of intellection, they don't. So they're always stressing the differences between animals and humans, despite the fact that they also recognize a lot of commonality between animals and humans. And finally, most philosophers in the Islamic world don't go in for reincarnation. So one of the main reasons why ancient philosophers might have admitted kinship between animals and humans is not available. So you might wonder, why did I just waste the first 20 minutes of this talk on a bunch of stuff that's not going to be relevant? But as you'll see, it's more relevant than it looks. So I now want to turn to the first of two kinds of moral reasoning, or the first of two moral principles that do play a role in animal ethics in the Islamic world. And this is divine providence. So here we're going to be looking at philosophers who argue for human benevolence towards animals on the grounds that God is benevolent towards animals, and we should be like God, right? God is perfectly good, so anything he does, it would be a good idea to imitate. And my first example is someone we've already met, and we'll meet again tomorrow, which is Abu Bakr al-Razi, so the earlier Razi, not to be confused with Fakhruddin al-Razi, as I said. So he is the author of perhaps the single most famous discussion of animal ethics in the Islamic world, which comes from a short work called The Philosophical Way of Life. It's a really interesting text. Basically, what's going on here is that some unidentified opponents of his have complained to him about the way he lives his life because he's not enough of an ascetic. So they say, you're always saying that you follow the ideal of Socrates, and everyone knows that Socrates was a rigorous ascetic and you're not. And he says, well, Socrates was a rigorous ascetic when he was young, but then he got over it and started drinking wine and having kids. And that's the Socrates that I'm like. It's a very charming little text, actually. I highly recommend reading it. It's also only a few pages long, so his personality comes across really, really strongly. He's kind of sarcastic and funny and smart. I love Razi. He's really fantastic. So anyway, in order to defend his way of life, he then goes on to explain a whole bunch of principles that he abides by and how he kind of follows, how he kind of puts these principles into practice in his everyday life. And in the context of doing that, he says that something that a lot of people do wrong, and that he presumably doesn't do wrong, is that a lot of people mistreat animals, and he wouldn't do that. He actually doesn't explicitly say that he wouldn't do that, but it's clear that that's the point, right? So there's all these things people do wrong, like they overeat and whatever. And one of the things they do wrong is that they torment animals, which they shouldn't do. So I'm going to read a pretty big passage from this context. It goes on at some length, as you'll see. I'm going to summarize the rest of it. So he says, we say that a principle we laid down, which was that our Lord and Master, in other words, God, is concerned for us, watches over us, and is merciful to us, further implies that he hates for us to suffer pain, and whatever we suffer is nothing we earned due to our choices. Rather, it is natural, and due to something necessary, whose occurrence is unavoidable. So we only ever experience pain that couldn't have been avoided otherwise, because God takes care of us. From this, it follows that we ought never to cause any pain to any sentient being unless it is deserved, or in order that by this pain we can avert some other pain which is worse. And from there, he goes on to give some examples and qualifications to this general rule. So the examples include, you shouldn't overload pack animals and make them work too hard. Maybe you should be a vegetarian. So he says some philosophers are vegetarians, some aren't. You shouldn't ride a riding animal so hard that it suffers or maybe even dies. Although he says you might be allowed to do this if you could save the life of a human. So imagine a human is rushing away from an enemy and the enemy wants to kill the human. The human might be allowed to ride the horse to death in order to escape. And when he says this, he then says, especially if the human being is knowledgeable, good, or wealthy in some way that is useful for the benefit of all humankind, which I think is quite funny because he must be thinking of himself, right? So this like very expert doctor. who's just in the middle of telling you what a good guy he is, right? So he's exactly the sort of person who would be allowed to ride a horse to death, I guess. He also says that you can harm other animals if they harm other animals. So for example, carnivores could be hunted because they go around killing other animals. And so you're indirectly saving a whole lot of animals by killing the carnivore. He also says, and this is very inscrutable, and it would be great if he said more about it, but he says, also there are some animals that are so kind of lousy and kind of despised, like snakes and scorpions, so like really crummy animals, where you'd be doing them a favor if you killed them, because their souls may then escape from their body and come into better bodies, which is a very striking thing to say. So actually, despite the supposed irrelevance of everything I said in the first 20 minutes, you can see that a lot of what I said is directly relevant, right? So what that last thing about if I kill a scorpion, maybe it gets a better body, makes it sound like the scorpion could get reincarnated, right? And next time, maybe it won't be a scorpion, maybe it will be a dog, or maybe it will even be a human. And that would be excellent for the scorpion's soul, right? Because who wants to be a scorpion? That's nasty. But, it could be a golden retriever next time around. It would be lovely, right? Now, I have to say that in other contexts, I have argued that it's not clear whether Razi is committed to this. First of all, he only says it in a very non-committal way anyway. He says, well, you might think that this could happen. So it's not clear that he's endorsing it anyway. And even if he is, he does not say that animals can come into human bodies. Although there are later reports that suggest that he said that, but I think they're just extrapolating from the passage I'm talking about now. So I don't think they have more information than we have. So it's not quite clear what he thought about reincarnation, but at least he sort of alludes to it as a rationale. Notice, though, that he doesn't do it in order to establish kinship between humans and animals. He does it just to give you an excuse to kill scorpions, right? So it's somewhat different than the use of reincarnation we saw in the Platonist Pythagorean tradition. More strikingly, he talks about the whole reasoning process of how to treat animals as if he were Peter Singer, right? So he even says, right, I'll go back to the passage. He says, we should, from this it follows, we should never cause pain to any sentient being. And he uses the word his, which can mean sense perception. So he really means we shouldn't cause pain to anything that can feel pain, just like Peter Singer does, same cutoff for our concern. And he talks about it in a pretty strongly consequentialist way. So remember that kind of funny thing about if I'm really useful to society, then I'm allowed to ride a horse to death because I'm a doctor, let's say, like Razi was. Well, that sounds like a consequentialist argument, right? It's bad for the horse to be ridden to death, and that's a shame. And it really is bad because the horse's interests are being violated, the horse is suffering and dying. But the payoff is sufficiently large that I'm allowed to do it. Just like a utilitarian might be in favor of experimenting on animals if there were a good enough prospect of saving a lot of lives for doing it, right? Same kind of reasoning. So actually, we have a very strong resonance between this and both some stuff we found in ancient philosophy and some stuff we found in modern day philosophy. However, it's not clear that that's kind of the ethical bedrock here of what's going on. So as I said, he doesn't use reincarnation to establish kinship between animals and humans. And also, although he sounds like a consequentialist or even a utilitarian, maybe he isn't. Because remember that when he says, here's the principle I'm following, the principle is God hates us for us to suffer pain, and we should be like God. So actually, I didn't quote this, but in the same work, he quotes the famous line from Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, where Plato has Socrates say that humans should be imitating God insofar as possible. So for Razi, the reason to be benevolent towards animals is that animals can suffer. And we know that God doesn't like suffering because God tries to prevent us from suffering. So we shouldn't cause animals to suffer. You might even think that we sort of stand in a benevolent relationship towards animals the way that God stands towards us, right? And so ultimately, this is, as I've been suggesting in this section, the real principle that he's following here is that we should imitate God and be providential the way that God is providential. Now, against that, if you wanted to defend a consequentialist reading of Razi, you could say, well, sure, but why does God hate suffering? Doesn't he hate suffering because suffering is bad? So God is a consequentialist too, right? So actually, behind this principle that we should imitate God, there's an even more bedrock underlying principle, which is a consequentialist principle, namely avoid suffering, because suffering is intrinsically bad, just like Peter Singer would say. That might be right. And if that's right, then it might show that Razi is actually ultimately closer to a Kalam way of thinking about ethics than a sort of Greek-inspired Falsafa way of thinking about ethics, right? So ultimately, it's all about what God wants, and what God wants is that God is a consequentialist. Another text which I think goes along some of the same lines is Ibn Tufah's Hay ibn Yaqzan, a wonderful text in which the central character, Hay ibn Yaqzan, grows up alone on an island and educates himself to be a philosopher. So here we have, I think, a pretty clear resonance with what I was talking about with ancient philosophy, in that Ibn Tufah tells the story in such a way as to really emphasize the kinship between Hay, the main character who's growing up alone on the island, and the animals on the island. So he's not alone on the island, right? He's alone in the sense that there are no humans, but he's not alone because there's lots of animals. In fact, a gazelle becomes his mother when he arrives there as a baby and raises him. So in the opening chapters, Ibn Tufah describes Hay's sort of self-education and maturation in a way that really emphasizes Hay's animal nature. So we even have a passage where Hay puts feathers and fur on himself so that he looks like an animal in order to scare the other animals so they won't hurt him. So we're really being asked to think of Hay as an animal. But I actually don't think that that has anything to do with the discussion of animal ethics in the treatise, because the idea is pretty clearly, in my opinion, that Hay is supposed to transcend his animal nature and realize his human nature and be better than the animals on the island. But when he does that, he starts to make all of these philosophical discoveries. And one of them is that he should be benevolent towards the animals and actually even towards the plants on the island. So he does things like shifting things around so that plants aren't in more shade than they should be so that they can flourish. And he stops eating meat. In fact, he even stops harvesting plants for his food. So he becomes what would nowadays be called a fruitarian. He only eats like berries and fruits that he can pick from plants without killing the plant. And what's interesting is that the reason that's given for this is very much like the reason given by Razi, namely that Hay is trying to imitate God. So here's what Ibn Tufah says about his reasoning. The plants and animals were the act of the necessary existent, namely God. And it was clear to Hay that he would become happy by nearing it, the necessary existent, and seeking likeness to it. Inevitably, if he sought nourishment from plants and animals, he would cut them off from their perfection and prevent them from the ultimate end they were pursuing. This would be putting an obstacle in the way of the act of the agent, an obstacle opposed to the nearness and likeness he was seeking. So he realized it would be right for him, if it were possible, to abstain from nourishment completely, so he should just stop eating. But this was not possible, given that there was no way to do it without destroying his body, which would constitute a greater obstacle to the agent than the first, since he was nobler than those other things. So the thought here is that in order to be like God, he has to providentially look after the plants and animals, just like God does. And in fact, he shouldn't even eat at all, because he should only be benevolent towards nature. He should never destroy any of it. But of course, he has to destroy at least something in order to, like, he has to at least pick fruits off the trees and get nuts or whatever in order to avoid dying himself, because God wouldn't want him to die. So here we have a very clear appeal, just as in Razi, to the idea that it's divine providence and its likeness to God that should drive us towards benevolence towards animals. And something I want to point out is that when he's justifying the idea that God is in favor of, or that God is showing benevolence towards animals, let's put it that way, that God wants good things for animals, he appeals to the idea of the perfection of the animals. So he says that if he ate the animals, he would cut them off from their perfection and prevent them from the ultimate end they were pursuing. So within this appeal to divine providence, there's a kind of subsidiary point, which is that animals have a perfection which they're pursuing, which we should not disrupt. So in other words, he's thinking about teleology. Here, that's a pretty minor point, but there's another philosopher in whom I think it looms larger, and this is Miskowe, who's an interesting thinker who lived around the same time as Ibn Sina. So he died in 1030 CE, and he writes a very influential and important ethical work called The Refinement of Character, Tahdib al-Akhlaq. So I'm going to be drawing on that and some other works by Miskowe, both in today's lecture and tomorrow's lecture. So the core idea here is going to be that animals have interests maybe in a broad sense, very much along the lines that Korsgaard referred to, namely, they are natural goods that animals are pursuing. And she has a pretty minimal treatment of that, I guess. So she just says, well, like animals have, it's a natural good for animals that they don't undergo pain and that they don't get killed. But you could have a much richer approach to animal teleology than that by looking at the works of Aristotle and Galen, which go on and on and on about the teleological design of nature in general and animals in particular. And this is something I mentioned in the first lecture, right? So in the zoological treatises of Aristotle, and also in a work like On the Usefulness of the Parts by Galen, you have this pretty elaborate picture of animal and human bodies as being teleologically designed. In other words, every bit of of the human body and of an animal body has a purpose. And also each animal or human as a whole has a purpose. So for example, giraffes have a purpose, which is to flourish as giraffes. You knew that giraffes were going to get mentioned eventually. So giraffes have a purpose, which is to flourish, like to live a flourishing life on the savannah. And towards that end, they have a long neck, which allows them to get leaves off trees. Interestingly, giraffes also use their long necks to fight with each other. If you want to see something really shocking, then Google like a video of giraffes fighting with their necks. It's quite astonishing. They just like whack their necks against each other so hard that you think their heads are going to pop off. It's really, quite upsetting actually. In any case, so they fight with their necks, but they also use their long necks to help them get leaves off tall trees. Let's just say that that's also true. I don't even know if that's true, but let's say that it's true. So so Aristotle would say, if you knew about giraffes, that the long neck has a purpose, namely to aid the giraffe's nourishment, and the nourishment of the giraffe has a purpose, which is to contribute to the overall flourishing of the giraffe. And all this comes into the Arabic tradition very strongly. For example, Ibn Sina's treatise on zoology in his Shifa has a lot to say about teleology as well, and the purpose of various parts of animal bodies. Of course, his medical treatises also take this into account and talk about the purposes that various parts of the human body are designed to achieve. But I don't want to talk about Ibn Sina. I want to talk, as I say, about Miskowe. And the reason really is basically that I just wrote a paper about animals in Miskowe. So I've been thinking about this a lot. And I was surprised when I started looking into this to discover that he has a lot to say about animals, both in the text that I mentioned, The Refinement of Character, and in a set of answers he wrote to questions about philosophy posed to him by another scholar who was a friend of his named Tawhidi. which was recently edited and translated by Sophia Vassalou. And it's a really wonderful book. It's really interesting and touches on a huge range of philosophical topics. So well worth looking into if you're interested in this period of philosophy. So I'm going to be quoting from both of those texts. Now, in the Refinement of Character, there's a striking line, which seems like a kind of throwaway remark, where he's talking about justice. And he says, one of the things that's distinctive about just people is that they show justice towards, as he says, friends, family, tribe, other people who are further away still, and then to other animals. And then he just kind of moves on. And you're like, wait a minute, what? Why? Right. So what I want to try to figure out here is, why does he say this? First, I want to point out that this passage is actually quite reminiscent of something that we find in Antiquity, which is the passage in a Stoic philosopher named Hierocles, in which Hierocles says that the virtuous person, like the Stoic sage, is someone who has learned to extend the circle of concern that one normally feels about oneself to include other people, not only one's family, but also one's friends, one's fellow citizens, and indeed the whole world, right? So as far as people who live on the other side of the planet, which itself, by the way, sounds like the sort of thing Peter Singer would say, right? So Peter Singer, one of the things he also has talked about in his utilitarian ethics is contributing money to help people in less fortunate countries and so on. So this is actually quite a lot like that, except that Miskaway says that you should extend the circle of concern to animals. And you might think that the reason he says this is because animals are sufficiently like us that we should feel this at least distant feeling of intimacy towards them, right? So just as we, and think about the way he sets it up, right? So he says, when I apply justice, I should take into account my friends and family, so the nearest people to me, and then my tribe, so people who are not quite that near but still have a lot in common with me, and then other people, because there are people like me, and then animals. So you might think that his reasoning here, just because of the way he puts it, you might think that what he's thinking is, well, this is kind of a scale of similarity, and animals are similar enough to me as a human that I should still show justice towards them. And justice will be like not, for example, causing them suffering for no reason. In support of this, there's a passage in his correspondence with Tawhidi where he has been asked by Tawhidi, why is it that some people have reluctance about the ritual slaughtering of animals, and if they see it happen, they get upset. Notice this is very similar to something I mentioned in the first lecture from the Chinese tradition, where this king is sort of creeped out by sacrificing a bull. And by the way, I think I got the details on that slightly wrong. So actually what he does is he substitutes a sheep instead of a bull to be killed because it doesn't bother him as much. I don't know why that would be less bothersome, but anyway, so this is the same thought. So again, we have worries about ritual sacrifice here, just as we had in China and India and in ancient Greece. And Miskaway's answer to this question, why people are so creeped out by seeing violence towards animals, is the following. The sense of repugnance people feel about slaughtering animals is due to the fact that they share animality with them. For when something bad happens to a beast, it crosses their mind that something similar will happen to them because they share animality with it. Now, that looks like he is at first glance, it looks like he might be invoking kinship with animals as some kind of basis for animal ethics or benevolence towards animals. But actually, if you look at it closely, maybe not, right? Because especially the last sentence, when something bad happens to a beast, it crosses their mind that something similar will happen to them because they share animality with it. So the point is not that shared animality is a basis for moral concern. It's more like, just as if you see something something bad happen to another person, you're like, oh, that could have been me. Similarly, you're enough like a sheep that if you see a sheep sacrificed, you sort of imagine your own throat being cut and bleeding to death, right? And it's very upsetting. But actually, the killing of the sheep doesn't obviously matter at all to this person. They're thinking about themselves being killed and slaughtered. Furthermore, he goes on to say in this passage to Tawhidi, he says, well, people can get over this like butchers. They see it all the time, so it doesn't bother them anymore. So he doesn't really seem to think this is a good way of thinking about animal ethics or a good principle for animal ethics. Furthermore, and this is something we're going to see tomorrow, I'm going to talk more about Miskawayh in the last lecture. Miskawayh does not think that you should be exploring or celebrating or emphasizing your similarity to animals. He thinks you should be trying to be less like an animal, not more like an animal. In fact, most of the time when he mentions animals in his ethical works, what he's doing is saying, don't be like an animal. And we'll see what that means tomorrow, but it's about like self-control and using rationality again. So it would be very strange if he grounded animal ethics in the idea of celebrating or like feeling a sense of solidarity because of our kinship with animals. And in fact, I don't think that's what he's doing at all. Rather, I think that he, being a good enough Aristotelian to recognize that animals have goods that they are pursuing because they're teleologically designed, he thinks that you shouldn't thwart those goods. For example, there's a passage in the Refinement of Character where he's talking about pleasure, and he says, true pleasures reside in complete perfections and common ends. It was with these in view that humankind was created, indeed the other animals too, and in fact all existing things. Actually, that might be from his treatise on pleasure. I'm not sure. It's from one of the two. It's from either his treatise on pleasure or from his Refinement of Character. So what he's doing here is he's recognizing that humans are just like animals in that they have activities that they should be performing, and they take pleasure in these activities, right? Now, again, you might think, oh, look, it's consequentialism. It's just like Peter Singer, right? Pleasure is good, suffering is bad. Animals can take pleasure in the things they do, so we shouldn't thwart that because pleasure is good. But actually, that's not what he's saying. So Miskawayh was absolutely not a hedonist. He did not think that pleasure as such is good, and he argues against this in several places for several different reasons, which aren't necessarily always consistent, but he is consistent in not being a hedonist. His point is not that we should be nice to animals because we don't want to disrupt their pleasure. His point is that we should be nice to animals because we don't want to disrupt the activities which bring them perfection. And then he thinks that pleasure is a sign of that. It comes on top of the activity that leads to perfection. If you know Aristotle, then you know where he got this, right? So what he's thinking here is of the account of pleasure that's given in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, whereby pleasure is something that supervenes or comes along with a complete or perfect activity like eyesight, for example. So this is not a utilitarian argument. This is a teleological argument. And I think that the reason why he thinks you should show justice towards animals, therefore, is that you would be thwarting the teleological purpose that they were designed for. Notice, though, that the two themes that I've highlighted, namely divine providence and teleology, are really quite closely connected. And in fact, maybe on further inspection, they're just the same idea. Because actually, even in this bit that I just quoted from Miskawayh, he says that it was with complete perfections and common ends in view that humankind was created, and also the other animals. So there's a kind of background idea here about divine creation and providence, right? And we also saw that in Tufal, when he's saying that Hai wants to imitate God by showing benevolence towards animals, the thing that makes Hai realize that animals are in fact objects of God's concern is that they're so well designed and so purposefully designed. In fact, this is not surprising, but it's still worth noting, animal teleology is often given as a kind of proof of divine providence. So along with things like, the stars move in perfect orbits around the earth and everything's so well designed, right? And the rainfall, like Aristotle mentions, we always get reference to animal bodies as a classic case of divine providence at work. For example, there's a short treatise by the Christian philosopher Yahya ibn Adi, which is about whether God knows particulars or not, which is an anticipation of a discussion we famously later on get in Ibn Sina. And Ibn Adi, as an example to show that God must know particulars, he mentions the design of the limbs of the human body. So he says, these limbs, which are evidence of God's wisdom, are each individually the limbs of a single people, but not of the universal human, since the universal human has no limbs. Right? So God had designed my hands and not a universal hand, right? Because I guess his idea is that if all God knew about was the universal human, then God wouldn't know about individual body parts because that's not included in the content of human. So actually, if we sort of take these things together, we can put the two principles into a single theory, according to which we shouldn't violate the interests of humans. We shouldn't violate the interests of animals. We know about the interests of animals because of their teleological design. And furthermore, this teleological design implies that they had a designer. So by thwarting their teleological design, we would be thwarting God's will, or if you like, failing to be as much like God as possible, which is what we should want to do, according to Razi and Ibn Tufa. You can see that there's a lot of Greek philosophy behind this idea, right? So in particular, the idea of teleology comes in from Aristotle and Galen. But equally, it's clear that there's a Muslim, or rather an Islamic background to this, because certainly the idea of divine providence is deeply Quranic. And there are even passages in the Quran that suggest a teleological design in nature being something we can ascribe to God. Ibn Tufayl actually even quotes from the Quran the line, "Our Lord is he who gave everything its nature, then guided it." And since that could be applied to animals, this would be Quranic evidence for the line of thought that I've just been sketching. So in conclusion, this, I think, brings us back to the question of how everything I've just been talking about in the Islamic tradition compares to ancient and modern animal ethics. So one thing is that, remember I said, well, all the stuff I just said about ancient and modern ethics probably won't be that relevant. And one reason is that they weren't consequentialists, right? But actually we saw that Razi, at least, has a pretty large commitment to some kind of consequentialist reasoning. It's not so clear whether that's sort of the bedrock of his ethical theory. In fact, I think it isn't, but at least he's capable of thinking about things in consequentialist terms because he thinks God wants us to, right? Whether he's ultimately a consequentialist maybe depends on how he thinks God is determining what is and is not welcome to him. Furthermore, both in Korsgaard and in Singer, we had appeals to animal interests, which is a kind of vague word, but we can see that it's a word that they might have used if they were writing in early 21st century English to describe these things, because when they talk about the teleological purposes of animals, what they're really saying is animals have an interest in certain activities. For example, being alive, being able to see, being able to eat, being able to reproduce. And that's like intrinsically good. And it's also part of a divine plan. So in some ways, ironically, despite all of the Greek ideas that are flowing into the Islamic tradition, you might even say that there are stronger resonances between the Islamic ideas I've just talked about in this lecture and the modern ethical debate, which involves consequentialist reasoning, appeals to interest, and so on. You might say that that's a stronger resonance than the resonance between the Islamic debate and the ancient debate, which, as I said, was all about kinship. And as I've argued, kinship really doesn't play a role in these texts that we've just looked at that argue for animal ethics. That's not to rule out that they might play a role in other treatises. For example, perhaps Ikhwana Safa would be a better example of that. So I wouldn't rule it out necessarily. But I think it's really striking that our Islamic treatises, or just at least discussions of animal ethics, are so reminiscent of things we've seen in much more recent animal philosophy. And I would say that the reason why they are like that is that the key ancient idea in animal ethics is precisely this idea of kinship between animals and humans. And they actually deny that for the most part, precisely for the reason that animals are not rational, and that the most important thing about us is that we are rational. And next time in the last lecture, I'm going to spell out more what that means and why it matters. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. So now we have time for questions, comments.